Я ухожу.
И собственник замучен, в конце концов.
Свобода лучше, чем не свобода.
Крым и Севастополь возвращаются в родную гавань.
Welcome to Infocom. In the new episode of Focus on Russia, our guest is former US ambassador to Georgia, former US representative to the OSCE, and the former US co-chair of the OSCE Minsk group, Ian Kelly, who works now as ambassador in residence at Northwestern University. Ambassador Kelly, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I would like to start our conversation with the situation, with the ongoing crisis around Ukraine. What is your view on the situation? Is the Biden administration capable of deterring Russia? And is the collective West doing enough to discourage Russia from radical actions?
Well, thank you for that question, Tigran. I think that the important thing for me, at any rate, is that there was no bargaining away of any sovereignty for Ukraine. There was no the right of Ukraine to join NATO. You know, its sovereign right has been maintained, and there was absolutely no suggestion that there would be any kind of bargaining about this, the right of all countries to choose their own security arrangements. And this is something that both the Soviet Union and Russia agreed to in several different documents in the 1990s. So whether or not keeping a very strong front and maintaining a firm grip on these principles will be enough to deter Putin, I don't know. And I think what concerns a lot of us is Putin has made he hasn't made suggestions for a negotiation. He has put something on the table and basically said, take it or leave it, leaving himself no room really to maneuver. And this take it or leave it approach doesn't leave Putin himself many options besides simply withdrawing, which I'm sure he would see as a sign of weakness. So these are perilous days. They're very, very concerning days, especially if you're in Eastern Europe.
I think that's the situation we have. And the risk of war is really high. And what is your view? What are the possible implications of a possible Russo-Ukrainian war on the South Caucasus region? Is there a risk that the region could become a new area for the fierce confrontation between the West and Russia?
Well, I think that there is already a competition between the West and Russia in the Caucasus. I regret to say it's really kind of a one-sided competition. Unlike in the 90s and the early 2000s, when the West, particularly the U.S. and France, were very much invested in finding a solution to the most difficult security problem. Of course, that's the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh. In recent years, I think that Russia has really kind of taken a unilateral approach and elbowed out the Western countries. And if you look at Georgia, the security situation there is more of a stalemate, obviously. That's not to say that it's not an active conflict, because it is. People are being kidnapped. There are occasional tragedies along the administrative borderline. But I think if I were in the Caucasus now, I would be concerned that there is the West is even more distracted, not focused on what's going on in the Caucasus. And of course, in that kind of situation, you can see great powers in the region, not just Russia, but also Turkey and Iran filling the vacuum. I mean, I don't see any reason to fear an imminent outbreak of combat. In fact, there are some I think very encouraging signs, particularly the new dialogue between Turkey and Armenia. But Caucasus obviously is seen as Moscow's sphere of privileged interest, as they call it, and again, I would just concern about the growth of the influence of illiberal powers in that region, specifically Russia, Turkey, and Iran.
Ambassador, you mentioned about the gradual decreasing role of the West in the Karabakh context and the growing Russian role. What do you think? What were the driving forces behind the process? Is that process connected with the global trends?
To a certain degree, I think it is. I think that you saw. I mean, I was an ambassador 2 times for President Obama, but I think that there was a recognition that Russia could accomplish more in terms of stopping the fighting and avoiding a full war, and so in many ways really kind of subcontracted the negotiation between the sides. Was supposed to be a trilateral process of the 3 co-chair countries, U.S., France, and Russia, but it was really a unilateral process, and that really began under President Obama. And then, of course, under President Trump, I don't think that there was any attention paid at all. I think the only interest the Trump administration had would be to sell weapons to the sides. There was one visit by the National Security Advisor where his main goal seemed to be to try to get the 2 sides to buy American weapons. And so, what we saw last year after the Second Karabakh War, we saw basically the complete marginalization of the co-chair countries. And I think that what concerned me the most and got relatively little attention was the peacekeeping force. And there is an office at the OSCE, and there was an understanding since 1994 that any peacekeeping force would be multilateral, and that any peacekeeping force would not include the 2 superpowers, the 2 major nuclear powers, the U.S. and Russia. And of course, what we have now is we have a Russia-only peacekeeping force, and a new multilateral mechanism, which doesn't include the U.S. or France or any Western country, the so-called 3+3 format. So, I mean, clearly, it's the choice of the warring sides how they want to approach the negotiations, how they want to approach the management of keeping the peace. But the end result is I think as I said before, the marginalization of the U.S. and Europe.
Yeah. Ambassador Kelly, you talked about the attitude of the Trump administration towards the conflict. What is the Biden administration approach to the Karabakh conflict? Is there a policy? And can we expect anything practical in this direction?
It's difficult for me to see that there is a policy, frankly, this is partially due to the long delay in naming senior officials. I mean, you really can't get an interagency consensus on a policy unless you have senior officials who are confirmed and in office. And the Assistant Secretary for Europe and Eurasia has only been in office a few months. But even so, I don't see a strategy anytime soon specific to the South Caucasus, and I say that with much regret, because I think that we have tended to see the South Caucasus in terms of military security, whereas I think it should be seen more as a single economic zone, and there really has to be, I think, a real effort by the U.S. and Europe to try and integrate the Caucasus countries into more of an east-west trade route rather than a north-south trade route. And if you look at the configuration of the 3+3 group, I think that the goal there is to have more north-south trade routes going through Russia. So I would hope that the U.S. and Washington and Brussels would come up with some sort of comprehensive strategy to try and integrate the Caucasus nations into integrated trade routes, perhaps across the Black Sea.
Ambassador Kelly, and my last question is about your role as the OSCE Minsk Group co-chair. Your co-chairmanship coincided with a period between the failed summit in Kazan and Russian proposals of 2015, which are also informally known as the Lavrov Plan. What was the negotiation situation during your tenure? Was there a chance that the parties to the conflict could reach a negotiated settlement at that time?
Well, I think that we had two major stumbling blocks, two major obstacles. The one was, of course, to try to get the two sides to agree to what we call the Madrid Principles. And the Madrid Principles really tried to negotiate a path between the insistence of the Armenian population on the principle of self-determination and the insistence of Baku on the principle of territorial integrity. And the two sides refused to sit down and talk until this whole package was agreed. And probably the most difficult part of the Minsk principles was the idea of the people of Nagorno-Karabakh having the right to a referendum to decide their future, and that never was agreed to. The other big issue that we dealt with, and this was more of a kind of a day-to-day issue, and that was the refusal, primarily, well, no, I'll say completely, the refusal of the Azeri side to agree to any kind of confidence and security building measures. You know, I was absolutely shocked when I first went to the line of contact at the absolute lack of dialogue across the lines. It was an extremely dangerous situation when commanders in the field really were not having regular communications across no man's land. So we tried to get some kind of agreement to have hotlines, to have regular meetings to discuss issues of concern and try to arbitrate disagreements on the model of what happens in both Moldova and in Georgia. You know, the Georgians have something called the incident IPRM, incident prevention and response mechanism, where all the sides sit down and try to hash out their differences on the ground, not on the big political issues, but on issues like access to water, access of livestock to different fields, things like that. And we couldn't do that because of the maximalist approach. Of course, Baku said they didn't want to normalize the conflict and refused to have any of these on-the-ground discussions as they had in Moldova and in Georgia. But it was very, it's frustrating, I think, for any Minsk group co-chair because the lack of progress is glacial. We knew that in order to really get some kind of progress, it had to come from the top, from the two presidents. And there was only one head of state among the three co-chair countries that was willing to do that, to bring them together and not knock some heads together. And of course, that was Vladimir Putin. And there was a recognition in Washington that the main thing was try to get progress. But it left us in a situation where you have one country whose motives in the post-Soviet space are not, shall we say, altruistic, in charge of managing the conflict. And as Secretary Blinken said the other day, the problem is that once Russian troops arrive, they tend not to leave. And of course, the people of Georgia and Moldova can attest to that.
Ambassador Kelly, thanks a lot for an interesting conversation.
Thank you. Very much appreciated it.